This episode of Harvey Brownstone Interviews is brought to you by the Bette Davis Jezebel Blend Coffee from Breakfast at Dominique's, Hollywood's most prestigious coffee company. You can order the Bette Davis coffee and all of the celebrity signature blends at hollywoodblends.com. Sit back with a cup of this wonderful coffee and enjoy this special conversation about the inimitable Bette Davis.
Hello, everyone. I'm Harvey Brownstone, and today's guest is an academic and a scholar who is an expert on the film career of the greatest movie star of them all, Bette Davis. Although Miss Davis received every accolade an actor can get, our guest asserts that Bette Davis has not been adequately recognized for her on and off-screen collaborative efforts to combat racism and support the African American community. In her latest book entitled Bette Davis, Black and White, our guest provides an illuminating exposé of Miss Davis's little-known behind-the-scenes work, such as supporting and mentoring Black actors, desegregating the dance floor of the legendary Hollywood Canteen, collaborating with Hattie McDaniel during the war to entertain Black servicemen, and joining several Black labor organizations. Our guest is the Charles Deering McCormick Professor of Teaching Excellence and Professor of English and American Studies and Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Department of English at Northwestern University. She's received numerous awards for her teaching and her writing. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Julia A. Stern to our show. Julia, thank you so much for joining us.
Harvey, it's a joy to be with you and an honor. Thank you.
Julia, we have something in common. We've both idolized Bette Davis since our adolescence. What inspired your passion for her?
I found her by accident on broadcast television in the early 1970s as a lonely, sort of disaffected proto-teen. And suddenly there were these melodramas available to watch late at night. I still have fantasies of figuring out who was the programmer in these various Chicago public television stations in the 70s. And after watching, I think it was Now Voyager for the first time, I may have just made that up because it's my favorite of all her films, I started reading the TV guide to look for opportunities for viewing her pictures. And I would circle, the Bette Davis entries in the TV guide, and it became kind of a religion. And I think I found enormous consolation and empathy in her performances of women, under siege in various ways, or women who were boldly taking action in unexpected and sort of dangerous venues. For a 12-year-old girl, this was extremely inspiring.
You wrote, and I'm quoting you here, Bette Davis ushered me into a world that celebrated the kind of female intensity and nonconformity for which I was notorious in the eyes of my parents. Julia, I find it fascinating that in the 70s, you were looking to movies from the 30s and 40s to inspire your feminism.
I've never actually thought of it that way. That's brilliant, Harvey. I think the 30s and 40s were a moment for women in Hollywood, particularly if we imagine the war coming in the late 30s and early 40s, where women were sort of what Hollywood movies featured, because in large part men were away fighting. And so we saw these plots and stories pitched to female audiences. And I have no profound sort of psychoanalytic explanation for why I was identifying with people in the 30s and 40s, only to say that the 70s, we think of Vietnam and we think of feminism, and queer rights all sort of fomenting in the 70s, which is absolutely true. But at the same time, there was a kind of entitlement and economic boom and privilege and complacency and sort of non-interest in politics as well going on in the 70s. And I think the ferocity of the women on the screen in the 30s just spoke more to my temperament.
Bette Davis made a lot of melodramas. You wrote that melodrama is the genre that makes virtue visible. What did you mean by that?
That's a quotation from a scholar at Yale, Peter Brooks, who wrote a book on melodrama that sort of changed the field, in which he explained that melodrama was invented in France right after the Revolution, when plays exploring the divine right of kings were no longer kosher to be performed because the king had been executed. And so the moral qualities of what had previously been in Racine and Corneille and in Shakespeare about a great man, of course, who'd fallen by his own folly and so forth, that plot line was out. And what became popular were stories about real people, common people, families, ripped apart by the great evil conflicts, like virtuous women being preyed upon by depraved men, or daughters and fathers being pulled apart. And virtue in these plays was screaming its name on stage. And this was a kind of democratization of the theater that began a shift away from the nobility of Shakespeare and so forth into a more populist realm of drama.
You make some very insightful comments about the characters portrayed by Black actors in the movies of the 30s and 40s. Actors Eddie Anderson, Matthew Beard, Butterfly McQueen, Hattie McDaniel, who often played stereotyped bumbling servants and buffoons. You said the actors managed to subtly communicate to the audience in their performances that their depictions of their characters were foolish and absurd. So they were actually having the last laugh. Julia, I had never realized that until I read it in your book. So I went back and I watched some of those scenes, and you're right. There is a tongue-in-cheek quality to those performances.
I sort of began to have this insight as a child viewer. I didn't understand why Stymie Beard in Jezebel was carrying on with the horse, or why when the Black enslaved characters in that same movie are waiting for the carriages of the company who are coming during the pandemic, the yellow fever pandemic, they sort of whoop it up to a degree of, using dialect and using foolishness to a degree that was so extreme, so excessive, that as a 12-year-old, it bothered me that these people were comporting themselves this way. And it felt dishonest. I knew nothing about minstrelsy or traditions of blackface performance, but I didn't understand why these actors were going so over the top. And it was like it gnawed at me. And this is what propelled the questions that led to the book.
Now, by my count, Bette Davis made 103 movies, but your book focuses primarily on 4 of them: The Little Foxes, Jezebel, In This Our Life, and Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. Why did you choose those films in particular?
Each of these films has a pairing of Davis with one or more Black actors that struck me as extraordinary. So in The Little Foxes, even though the Black children in The Little Foxes who come begging at the door for food are not featured with Davis herself, there's something going on in letting a bunch of child actors ad lib their lines essentially and take up screen time that doesn't advance the plot in any way. These seem almost like little set pieces that were inserted in the picture. And I want to note that William Wyler directed both Jezebel and The Little Foxes, and he has 2 of these, these set pieces are sort of his thing. And I think that, social commentary that doesn't advance the plot shouldn't be dismissed. In other words, we need to think about why these scenes are in the film. What are these Black actors doing? What are they saying? And so these are these sort of quiet moments, or loud and boisterous moments, or in The Great Lie, which I talk about a little bit, when the Hal Johnson choir is serenading the newlyweds, and we have this incredible little solo by a Black male singer talking about being parted from his sweetheart. And again, what's going on here? Why is this, and so I think that there were these opportunities in her pictures for Black performers to kind of do their thing, or to perform to excess, that were a way of sort of sneaking in resistance or protest, or, trying to represent Black humanity in a different way from the conscious level of the narrative that might have racist dimensions. So I think there was something about Bette Davis being on a set that allowed for Black actors to do their thing in a more creatively free way.
I want to ask you, Julia, about Jezebel. You examined Bette Davis's cross-racial sympathies with Black actors in the movie and her character Julie's decision to cross the color barrier and join the slaves in moments of play and musical celebration. She seems more attached to the slaves than to her own family. And you argue that Julie's decision to go with Preston to the yellow fever colony can be interpreted as a rejection of her white privilege. Why do you say that?
If you think about the family structure in that film, remember she's an orphan, and General Adolphus, I guess, is her legal guardian, and Aunt Belle is her sort of on the ground guardian, her auntie. Other than reprimanding Julie for transgressions, Aunt Belle, is sort of in the background. And it is with her slaves, her enslaved people, that she is, playing, laughing, bantering with, etc. And I think I should add that in the play itself, there was a drama that preceded the film. And in the drama, Owen Davis Sr. wrote the play Jezebel, which performed on Broadway 32 times, starring Miriam Hopkins. In the play, Julie is compared to a biracial woman, a biracial courtesan. And Preston is involved with biracial courtesans, and there is a discussion. Elite white men had biracial mistresses. This was well known on the plantation and off, and Julie is compared to one. So in the play itself, we actually have sort of data showing that Owen Davis Sr. imagined this character as not fully white. And so even though that doesn't make it into the screenplay or the production, I think there's a lingering quality to her relationship with her, like, for example, her relationship with Eddie Anderson, her coachman, Grobat. There's a moment where he takes her down from a horse, and it's an incredibly beautiful, almost dance-like movement where they've choreographed this. And there's an intimacy and a tenderness that is in no way inappropriate or sexualized, but it's a sort of tender moment which shows a complete ease between the Black and the white figures that suggests that she is somehow identifying more with her enslaved people than her own family.
I want to move on now to In This Our Life, where Bette Davis plays a racist, sociopathic monster who destroys a talented Black man studying to be a lawyer, played by Ernest Anderson. This 1942 movie is one of the first race films, but you pointed out that most critics completely ignored the anti-racism theme in the movie. Why?
Well, first of all, we should say that Anderson was discovered by Davis in the dining room of Warner Brothers. He was her waiter. But he had studied at Northwestern University in their famous drama department, and he had come to Hollywood to be in the movies. And she advised him to audition, and he got the part of Perry. And he hated the lines that had been written for him. And John Huston, who was only a second-time director, he had first been a writer on Jezebel, and his first film was The Maltese Falcon, which won an Academy Award first time out. John Huston basically said, okay, if you think these lines are racist, I'm translating into 21st century language, come up with something of your own that you'd prefer to say. And Anderson wrote this stealth, I call it stealth in that it was not, deputized by the script writers, this anti-racist screed talking about how a Black youth accused of a crime has absolutely no possibility in this world of getting a fair trial and getting a fair hearing. And remember, he's been studying the law with George Brent's lawyer as an apprentice, and he knows what he's talking about. His favorite book is Blackstone's Commentaries. So this scene so upset the censors in Hollywood, the Breen office, the production code of 1934, that censors across the country, in the South particularly, cut this soliloquy of rage against racism. And in Harlem, it was also cut. But James Baldwin, who is our wonderful sort of ethnic, our sort of native informant about this, saw the film both in in Harlem, cut, but on Broadway on 42nd Street, uncut. He saw the anti-racist screed. And I think the reason that the reception of this was so invisible in some way. I mean, the critics talked about the powerful melodrama. Some critics, even in the New York Times, Bosley Carruthers wrote in 1942, that there was a strong performance by a young Negro actor, and we will see more of him. But I think the fact that it was shut down throughout the country served to bury alive the reality of this film's, aggressive, bold, outspoken anti-racism voiced by a Black actor.
Well, it's incredible to me that Warner Brothers made the film, but they didn't have the guts to let Black audiences see a Black character speaking truth to power. Exactly. It's very upsetting.
It's very upsetting. And I think we've talked about this. The letters that the studio got from Black viewers were extraordinary. And I quote some of them in the book. The Black community of viewers who wrote in were very, were over the moon about the boldness of the message of this film, but it seems to have gotten lost in the white press.
Well, with all the clout that Bette Davis had back then, couldn't she have exerted some pressure on Warner Brothers to make them not cut Ernest Anderson's speech out of the film for Southern audiences?
I have a kind of hunch about this. I don't have a direct answer, but Davis hated the way she looked in the film so profoundly. And I think she dressed herself, she cut her own hair. I mean, she did all sorts of just incredible things to amplify the monstrosity of her character. I think she was so horrified by the way that came off. And the test audiences that viewed it in Pasadena and Los Angeles were horrified by her look and said, she can't look this way ever again, that she turned against the film and she never saw it again. And I talked with Catherine Cermak, her former assistant and memoirist, and Catherine said they never watched that film again, that she sort of put it away. So I think it was the casualty of her concern for her image, alas, despite the fact that she empowered Ernest Anderson by asking him to audition. So the irony is really painful.
It's also ironic to me that at exactly the time that In This Our Life came out, in which Bette Davis was playing a racist, the real Bette Davis in her personal life was engaged in a lot of activism on behalf of the Black community. And Miss Davis hated the movie. And I hear you when you say that a lot of it had to do with the way she looked, but do you think she regretted playing a racist?
I think that's exactly right. This is the hunch part. She never talked about the content of the film. She always talked about the look of it as her reason for hating it. But I really began to think that she turned against herself. Even, though she did such a good job of playing this horrific, bigot, that in fact, the whole thing just sort of sickened her. And, maybe she even regretted playing the part. I think that her performance contributes to the anti-racism of the message of the film. So in fact, she was quite successful, but she didn't see it that way. And I think there may have been some regrets about playing the part.
Well, for whatever it's worth, as a fan, I'm sorry that Bette Davis hated that film because, as you point out in the book, this is one of the very few, if not the only, movie from the 40s where a Black character is educated and is aspiring to become a professional, successful, in this case, a lawyer. I think that even if she didn't like the movie, she must have at some level been very proud to bring this story to the screen. At least I hope so.
Well, I just say one more thing about that. She was very proud of Anderson's performance. And in, I think, the last autobiography, This and That, or it may be The Lonely Life, the first one or the second one, she talks about no one had ever seen a Negro, quote unquote, perform in this way. And, this made the African-American community very proud. So she does take some recognition of that.
Well, moving on now to Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, you wrote that this movie, and I'm quoting you here, offered a brutal parable of the short shelf life and ultimate disposability of women's celebrity, and it provided a powerful critique of the American family as toxic incubator of female ambition. Professor Julia Stern, I must tell you that you definitely have a way with words. That is so insightful and thought-provoking. I had to read that 3 times.
Oh, God. You know, bless you for your tenacity.
You've placed great significance on the friendship between Joan Crawford's character, Blanche, and Elvira, the Black housekeeper, played by Mamie Norman. Why?
Well, first of all, I should say that in the novel, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane by, I think it's Thomas Farrell, the housekeeper is not racially marked. And so, she has a Germanic name. I think it's like Gretchen, or I can't remember what the name is, but she is definitely not a Black character. And so the fact that Robert Aldrich cast Mamie Norman in this role transformed the film, because, you know, theoretically, if that character had been race neutral, who knows what the dynamic would have been. But in the case of Mamie Norman, it turns out, there's always a fascinating backstory with these Black actors. She was an academic trained in the history of theater, who taught at UCLA for 10 years courses on African-American drama that she made up whole cloth, ex nihilo, all by herself. She created a field. And here she is in this film, because she acted as well. She was on stage and also in small roles in films. And she didn't like the lines, again, that she had been given. They smelled racist to her. She talked about them sounding like coming from slavery time. And so Robert Aldrich, like John Huston, although I don't think they knew this of each other, said, why don't you write your own lines here? And she, out of nowhere, creates this scenario that she's going to have to be seeing a man about jury duty. She's not going to be able to come into work the next day. And I remember when I was rewatching it maybe 10 years ago, thinking, this is 1962. Black voting rights are the central issue of the civil rights movement. Oh my God, this actress is talking about, you know, the African-American agenda, political agenda for the civil rights movement. And she sneaked it in under the radar of, I have to miss a day of work. And that's when I began to sort of put the pieces together. And I should say that, you know, we think about auteur theory, the idea that a director like Hitchcock or John Ford has a signature style across his or her various films, and that we can identify a Hitchcock shot or narrative or tableau or dialogue. You know, if we were on a desert island, we could pick up that it was Hitchcock or John Ford. Robert Aldrich is not an auteur in that way, but I think that Mamie Norman and Bette Davis are playing those roles. Mamie Norman in inserting, you know, Black Lives Matter material into her film, and Bette Davis in insisting, and I learned this in my research, that she whiten her face, and that every day she and her makeup man, Perk Westmore, concoct this paste that he creates on his kitchen stove and brings into the studio and puts on her face every day for 28 days of shooting, and the woman did not wash her face for a month. What's going on with that? Why does she have to be white? Why does she have to be ultra white? What does that have to say vis-a-vis Mamie Norman, Elvira being African-American? What does it mean that she perceives Elvira as her enemy? What does it mean that she kills her? So this is how I sort of work backwards by funky details that bother me and try to figure out how they connect. And that's, you know, why Mamie Norman, you know, sort of steals Baby Jane in a certain way.
But the friendship between Joan Crawford's character, Blanche, and Elvira, the housekeeper, I think is important because Blanche treated her like an equal.
Like a sister, right? They are sisters at heart. They are, and I think Blanche says something, you know, you are my family, something like that to Elvira. And I think the fact that Elvira's race is not any issue between herself and Blanche. And whereas Jane says, you know, all African Americans essentially are liars. She says this to Blanche. Think about the fact that Blanche's name means white in French. And so we have white and Black versus the white of Baby Jane, and two different whitenesses, two different socio-emotional politics of race happening in the same household. Who is the real sister? What does it mean to be a sister? Think about, you know, in the Black community, sisters and brothers, right? And their significance.
It's amazing. It's amazing how you make people want to go back and see the movie again through your lens?
That's a teacher's dream. Can I just say, go back to the text? Thank you.
Well, let me tell you, you're a dream come true when it comes to for Bette Davis fans. And now I thought it was very interesting that on the set of Baby Jane, Bette Davis expressed concern about the effect on her image of being seen to kill a Black person. That's quite a personal evolution, considering that 20 years before, she wasn't concerned about playing a woman who destroyed the life of a Black man.
That's brilliant. That's absolutely right. And, you know, some cynical people could say, well, she just cares about her image. This isn't about her politics. But in fact, you know, not every actress of her vintage in 1962 would even make that connection. So I think it's, you know, telling us something about where she's coming from.
Julia, I can't resist asking you, did you see Feud, the TV miniseries starring Susan Sarandon playing Bette Davis and Jessica Lange playing Joan Crawford?
I saw it and I'm going to see it again. I loved it with this caveat. I hated Sarandon's performance. I don't think having big eyes is enough. And I think she's a brilliant actress in every other way, but I don't think she got the voice maybe, but the hips and the hand motions and, you know, I think it was more a cartoon. I thought Jessica Lange was sublime, you know, shatteringly brilliant, so powerful and so good that I, as a Davis fiend, was rooting for Joan Crawford in the picture. And the one thing I want to say is I thought the sets were the most lush and beautiful. I mean, the way he attends to interiors and color and you know, was just spectacular. And I don't know who could have played Bette Davis. I don't have a substitute, but I was so saddened that, you know, she didn't, you know, I felt like Lange got inside of Crawford in ways that Sarandon did not with Davis.
I agree with you, but I also can't imagine who could have.
No, exactly. And that tells us something too, doesn't it? About Davis's, you know,
her uniqueness,
her absolute uniqueness.
Bette Davis wore extremely white makeup in numerous films. Mr. Skeffington, The Little Foxes, The Private Lives of Elizabeth and Essex, and Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. You wrote that by making her face very white, Miss Davis was trying to accentuate the social superiority of her characters in those films. Do you really think that Miss Davis was actually trying to convey a message about racism by making her face so white?
I think it was unconscious for her. And of course, you know, when we're talking about the unconscious, there's no evidence, right? Except that I think that the fact that she did this 3 or 4 times across her career, each time playing an imperious white woman, that she was somehow expressing something about our culture's interest in whiteness as the signifier of superiority. And so I don't think that she had, you know, a social dogma that she wanted to purport. I think she had a gut feeling as an actor who was very, you know, she talks about loving Olivier's way of working because he's not a method actor. He's working from the outside in. And she claims that that's what she did as well. And I think that this whiteness was a grammar for her, a kind of language that somehow expressed something about these characters, not necessarily a political something, but something that I'm translating as political.
Now, no one is perfect, and you expressed great distress at a serious misstep that Bette Davis committed in 1978 when she had a picture taken of herself dressed in blackface to lament her 70th birthday. And then 10 years later, she put the photo in her last book and went on the Johnny Carson show and displayed the photo on national television. What do you make of that?
You know, when I saw the picture for the first time, maybe 12 years ago, my heart sunk and I didn't know what I was going to do. And I talked to everyone I knew about it. And I got a wonderful piece of advice from a friend who teaches at the University of Illinois. She said that her dissertation director, whose name is Colin Diane of Vanderbilt, said to her, when you find something in the archive coming at you like a full blast, something bad, something disruptive of your ideas and your thesis, run headfirst toward it. It will teach you something. And that's what I did. And, there is absolutely no rationale for what I find it, again, I'm a sort of psychoanalytic critic. So I find the fact that she did all this anti-racist work across her early career and then wound up in blackface, some sort of bizarre acting out, she was, again, telling us something about, she claims that she was in mourning for her career. So she saw this act as a kind of melancholy expression. And I think she saw it as an identification in some way with the African-American community, which she always felt identified with. But it backfired because what she was imitating was not authentic Blackness, but a tradition of buffoonery around blacking up that has been a part of the American theater since the 1830s. And it was always performed by white men who were racist. So it was sort of I think the best we can say is that it was an attempt to express solidarity in some way with the Black community that went terribly wrong. And I talked with Ernest Harden Jr., this wonderful African-American actor whom you interviewed so wonderfully a couple months ago, I guess. And I had this wonderful interview with him on the telephone about a year and a half ago. He was very kind and willing to talk to me. And I asked him what he thought about this, because he played against Davis in a film called White Mama, where he played her foster child to her, sort of fallen on hard times, downtrodden, once middle-class white woman. And he told me that it bothered him enormously as well when he actually acted with her 1 year after this experience. She didn't publicize it for 10 years, but so he learned about it 10 years after the fact, after he'd worked with her. And he thought that it was, a terrible mistake on her part, and, had potentially very difficult repercussions, but he attested to her love for the Black community, which he talked with her about numerous times, her love for him, her support of his work, her giving him pep talks about racism in the profession, which, she warned him were going to be coming. And he read it not as something that was, that we're all crazy to be upset about, but rather a tragic mistake that did not sort of outweigh the goodness that she's done in her anti-racist work.
For the benefit of all of our viewers, I urge you to watch my interview with Ernest Harden Jr. He did co-star with Bette Davis in 1980 in a made-for-TV movie entitled White Mama. Ernest is a very dear friend of mine. He has only wonderful things to say about Bette Davis, not only about her support for him personally, but for the African-American community. Yes. And my impression, Julia, for whatever it's worth, he didn't seem terribly concerned about her faux pas in wearing blackface. He simply thought it was an error in judgment.
Yes, I get melodramatic. Let me tone that down and say I absolutely agree with you. He thought it was an error in judgment, and he thought it had to do with her identification with the community. That sort of went awry. So my field is very interested, American literary studies is very interested in blackface masquerade issues. And so this for me, had lights and sirens around it, but she screwed up. And that's sort of what he said. And, look at the bigger picture. Yeah.
I also want to mention that in the last few years of her life, Bette Davis frequently wore the fashions of Patrick Kelly, who was a Black fashion designer from Mississippi, who died of AIDS only 12 weeks after Miss Davis passed away. She was his muse and was enthusiastically supportive of his fashions. She really was quite a forward-thinking and amazingly socially conscious person, wasn't she?
Absolutely. She met Patrick Kelly through Catherine Cermak, who was her assistant and the memoirist of Miss D and Me. And Catherine had been working as a press attaché for Patrick Kelly in Paris, and Miss Davis was coming through to receive an award, I think in Germany or Switzerland, and Catherine had her stop by, and apparently Patrick Kelly and his partner didn't know that Bette Davis was coming to dinner. I think it was a Thanksgiving dinner, and there she walked through the door. They hit it off. He was a fan of her movies from childhood, like you and I, Harvey. So we get another, on TV inspired figure. And he started sending her clothes, which she adored. And, the match was made. And every time she appeared on talk shows at the very end of her life, she was dressed in his clothes. And they were, they were so fabulous. She never wore a hat looking like a watermelon. Patrick Kelly combated racism in his fashion, his imaginative designs by doing things like creating hats like watermelons worn by Black models. And he had the image of the gollywog, which is sort of a little monstrous troll figure with very racist connotations. That was the emblem of his company. And so Davis wore all these things. And on David Letterman, he got so excited. He wanted her to stand up. She had question marks made on her dress in gold sequins. This was a bespoke moment for Bette Davis and Patrick Kelly. And Letterman had her stand up to kind of model this dress. And she accidentally bumped his water over his desk and soused him on his trousers. And he was mortified and trying to dry himself off. And she just sort of took the narrative and was hilarious. It's worth watching on YouTube. Those clothes also came at the time she had a stroke, had a mastectomy and a stroke. And I think her left side of her face never fully recovered from the stroke, although she did, Catherine, nursed her back to health. It took 2 years. And so these clothes were a kind of way of saying, I am still vivid and vibrant and witty, and I dare you, and, come ask me about these clothes. And she was so tiny at that point, she probably weighed 90 pounds, but she had these dresses that had these wonderful sort of buttons in the shape of hearts. And, woman was almost 80 years old. And here she was in cutting edge fashion. It's just, and Black, let us just say, supporting, she made an announcement on Letterman. Patrick Kelly is an African-American designer from Mississippi, blah, blah, blah. You can buy his clothes. I mean, it was like a little advertisement. It was wonderful.
It really was wonderful. And I want to thank you for mentioning Catherine Cermak. She did appear on our show as well. The name of her book is Miss D and Me, Life with the Invincible Bette Davis. And I hope you'll all watch that interview as well. Julia, do you have a favorite Bette Davis movie?
I think Now Voyager is my favorite. And I think it's my favorite because I watched it at first at age 12 and saw the ugly duckling turn into the swan, and then take up the swan's interdicted lover's rejected daughter and give her a mothering that she had never gotten herself. I think one of the things that appealed to me about the film was that the monstrosity of this mother was so over the top that, nobody could not, you couldn't not hate Mrs. Vale, right? She throws herself down the stairs. She's controlling her daughter's every breath. What's interesting about Now Voyager that I didn't appreciate till I was grown up is that she doesn't get the Prince Charming at the end. She gets, Cinderella's daughter. And that for 1942 is a really, really radically feminist ending. I see it as a feminist ending. She's also, endowing buildings at Cascade, the sanitarium that saved her life, with her mother's fortune. So she, and we can also say the clothing in the film, the spectacular clothing on board the ship when she's recovering from her sanitarium stay, and she's wearing borrowed clothes, and she looks like $1 million in her fripperies, her butterfly cape, and the beautiful white gown. She goes home, she has to give up the man, and she starts dressing in this very simple, elegant, but not splendid way. And it's an incredible message, I think, to women in the audience who were home alone during World War II, that the myth of Cinderella may not be as fulfilling as this other version, right, where the woman chooses to give up the man but take the child. So it appealed to me as a kid.
I only wish that Miss Davis were alive to hear your analysis of these films, because I think there is no other book that I'm aware of that does the kind of justice to the depth of these movies that yours has. And I urge every Bette Davis fan to get this book. By the way, just to tell you, my favorite Bette Davis movie is All This and Heaven Too.
Oh, I love that. The Duchess de Praslin.
That was a piece of work.
Right. Tell us why it's your favorite.
I loved that she played someone so kind and so sweet. And it was so rare for her to play that kind of loving, sweet, angelic character. So it just moved me very much. Her relationship with Charles Boyer
Oh,
and with the children in the movie, it touched me deeply.
I love that movie too. And those children, again, these child stars who are appearing with her are so underappreciated. Some of those kids grew up to, do their own things. And also, what's the Barbara O'Neill? Is that the name of the evil Duchess, the Charles Boyer's wife?
I can't remember.
But she doesn't usually play monster. So that everybody's got a different opportunity in that film.
Yes, for me, Bette Davis was the original Mary Poppins.
Oh.
Now, you completed the manuscript for the book 13 days before the brutal murder of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer, which triggered a national explosion of anti-racism protests. In some ways, it doesn't feel like we've made much progress since the 30s and 40s when Bette Davis was expressing indignation over inequality and unfairness. That's so depressing, isn't it?
It's utterly depressing. And I would like to suggest that your viewers take a look at In This Our Life and watch the speech of Ernest Anderson, Perry, who talks about the justice system in this country sort of not functioning at all when it comes to Black, the accused who are Black. It's remarkably depressing. It's remarkably depressing. The Aubrey conviction gives us a tiny ray of hope. The man who was murdered in Georgia for being Black while jogging. We have these flickers of hope. And when Chauvin was convicted, which happened maybe 6 or 8 months ago, I can't even remember, but I think the book was in production. I mean, all these things, backwards and forwards we go. You think that these issues are so black and white and so obvious and so sort of uncontroversial. And here we are.
Absolutely. Well, I think your book is so timely. It's so relevant. I actually think it makes a perfect Christmas gift for every Bette Davis fan. So I'm so glad we're having you on the show now. Julia, I have to tell you, after reading your book, I had to go back and rewatch every film you wrote about. And it was like I was seeing them for the first time. I learned so much through your book. Thank you so much for writing this amazingly thought-provoking book. And thank you, Julia, for taking the time to come on our show.
You are the ideal interlocutor. Thank you, Harvey.
Our guest has been Professor Julia Stern, author of Bette Davis, Black and White. My name is Harvey Brownstone. Thank you to our producer, Steve Silver. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out all the great interviews on the Harvey Brownstone Interviews YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when new videos are posted.